Tash, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Jo.
So to kick us off, can you give me a bit of a rundown about who you are, where you're from, where you're based now, and to give like listeners and viewers a bit of an idea about why I'm in conversation with you today?
Firstly, thank you so much for the invite. So my name's Tash Mirando, Dr. Tash in Singapore. And I am currently based in Singapore. I work for a private GP called Osler Health International. I moved almost a year ago, actually, back to Singapore. I have lived in quite a few places, and actually we talk about sort of trailing from a spouse point of view, a partner point of view. But actually my trailing journey started when I was 14, when I moved from Sri Lanka to London when my mum moved for work. And that was meant to be a 2-year move, became 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Ended up going to medical school. And then from there, actually finished my junior doctor training, which is when the partner side came into play. And then we ended up moving to, meant to move back to Sri Lanka for a little while, but then ended up moving to New Delhi in India for my husband's work, so Suranga's work. And yeah, and that's sort of how it all really kicked off. So from India, we were there for a few years. Suranga then moved to Singapore, and the plan sort of almost 10 years ago was then to move to Singapore and to be in Singapore. But I ended up moving back to London to finish off some bits and pieces with my general practice work and training. So Suranga ended up moving from Singapore, following me back to London, actually, which was actually lovely because we had such a good time in London. And I've actually just been for the last week because I've been working. I keep my NHS license going, and it's been brilliant. So I'm a little jet lagged, but I think we'll be fine. And yeah, so then we long-term really looking at where we want to be based, also with our family being in Sri Lanka, getting a little bit older. And also it's important for us, family is really important. And we've always wanted to be as close as possible. Being in London with the pandemic, not being able to travel back for 2 years was actually really tough. And when an opportunity came up with regards to being in Singapore, we took it. And actually no regrets at all. Love being back, being closer to family, being able to travel again. And so now we're sort of settled into Singapore life.
So good. It's an interesting concept. The trailing part is not always the spouse, but being the child that's following around. It's a really interesting concept as well.
And that's why I wanted to bring it up in particular, because whether you are, Singaporean, whether you are Australian, British, wherever in the world you are, it's not just about the partners. There's, a lot of the times there's kids involved, and especially here in Singapore and this part of the world, sometimes when there's travel, especially moving every 3 to 4 years. When I was in India, I worked for the US Embassy as a medical officer, and the moves there for families were every sort of, couple of years, 3 to 4 years. So when you're picking up your entire family and moving globally, it's not easy. But there's lots of things that can be done and looked at in advance to make sure that everyone's on board and the support that needs to be there is there.
Well, and I think that that's a really good point, because I think that's something that we've really tried to focus on with the Trailing Spouse Code, that it's not just the expat scene that is a trailing spouse and family, that it is often like I said, a defence family that is moving around with someone that's being posted in different countries. It can be those moving to a rural or farming community because they've married a local farmer. It could be that you're actually trailing a professional services or like a doctor, for example, like Suranga, your husband, following you around the place as a doctor's spouse, but that could be the same for teachers, for police officers, for nurses, for all sorts of people that end up finding themselves moving around. I think that everyone sort of faces those same challenges. And so I was really interested to have you come along, because I guess you're seeing it very much with an expat lens here in Singapore, but I'm really interested to hear about the sort of common themes and challenges that you find that trailing spouse is coming to you in a medical sense, because quite often, well, that in itself, finding a doctor when you move to a new place is often a challenge as well. And I have to fully disclose in this that you are my GP in Singapore, and have obviously had such a fabulous experience being able to find you so early just by chance when we arrived in Singapore. But I think that what listeners will sort of find is that the themes that you're seeing with an expat crowd in Singapore are so similar across those other groups of people who find themselves moving to places. Is there 3 sort of common themes that you're finding that obviously trailing spouse lens that you're seeing in an expat scene here in Singapore, but is there sort of 3 common themes that you're seeing that you think actually would be apparent and common across all those different types of groups of people that we've been talking about?
Sure. I mean, it's looking at it not just from an expat sense, but also from global locals here. I mean, I guess here in Singapore, you're looking at Singaporeans who have lived across the globe, who've come back, and the same would apply anywhere else in the world. I mean, the main things I would say is, especially with constant moving, would be, in a sense, actually sacrificing professional goals. For me as a doctor, it's having to pick myself up and move, looking at licensing. You can't always get a license depending on where in the world you are. I've been lucky that I have been able to work where I've lived. But it's also then that if you're not working, especially as a professional, whether it's your choice to move or not, and conversations have taken place, it's having that loss of financial independence that goes with sacrificing your professional goals, and also looking at long-term what that means, especially with the stop-start career. Then moving on, it's also looking at, depending on where you move to, there could be language barriers. We're lucky here in Singapore that, for me as a first language, English is the first language. English is spoken so freely here, and you don't have an issue. But, living in India, for example, it was a struggle. We learned to adapt, we learned language, but it's not easy when you're not a local in certain countries across the world. And then it's a culture shock that also sets in. It's a great experience because you learn, you make so many new friends, and you also learn to adapt and adjust. And it's just really nice to know how different people are and think and live really as well. And finally, actually, I would say one of the more difficult ones with moving all the time is, I mentioned about friendships, but it's also about then leaving family behind and leaving friends behind. And I think that's really tough, especially because that falls as part of that support network you need, especially when there are kids involved.
And I think that culture shock is something that, again, thinking of the different groups of people that are trailing around, that culture shock can be as big a thing for someone moving from a city area to a rural area as it could be moving to a country where you don't speak the language as your first language. Like, I've lived in little towns. The culture shock is real.
It's been really fun getting to know parts of Australia I'd never heard about, Joe. Thanks.
Oh, very much. So I think you get to see, well, you're at the coalface for a lot of people as well. And I think that for a lot of people, by the time they actually go and see a GP with issues, especially men, not generalizing whatsoever, they're notorious for waiting till things are really bad until they go and actually seek medical and professional help. But I think, like, what are some of the, I guess, what's the word? I don't know. What are things that people are presenting with where that you're like, I can actually see that I don't think that this is so much a physical ailment, but it is actually potentially a headspace thing with where you're at with your move or your relocation or those sorts of things?
I think one of the things that sort of tends to get picked up early is anxiety. I know we all talk about depression, low mood, but even before that is noticed, it's the anxiety. So it can present from actually physical symptoms. So chest pain, for example, is one of the biggest symptoms that come up. And a lot of the times it's got nothing to do with the heart. It's the way the anxiety presents, and that can then move into being short-tempered, then change in mood, lack of sleep, and actually insomnia or change in sleep pattern can be one of the first things along with the anxiety that kicks in, because you're constantly thinking about things, you're remunerating, and then when you get into bed, that's when the quiet sets in, and you're not in a position to then sit and talk to someone about it. So you're up for hours, you then may fall asleep, but then you wake up in a panic and a cold sweat, and that completely breaks the sleep-wake cycle. And sleep is one of the most important things as part of sort of lifestyle medicine and the 6 key pillars that we need to look at. And once the sleep gets affected, it then becomes difficult during the daytime, because then you're more tired, you can get more grumpy, anxiety gets worse. So it's unfortunately a vicious cycle. And a lot of the times people have been going through it for weeks, if not months, if not longer, before anybody around them realizes, or they themselves realize and say, actually, I need some help.
That's so interesting. And I think, well, I don't know, like I think about my own personal experience. Like I have had some different trailing spouse experiences. This has been my first time as an expat trailing spouse, but another interesting experience that I had was following my husband when he was playing rugby in a number of countries before we had kids. And it was obviously a different stage of like career-wise and kids-wise for me when we were doing the rugby scene. But there was that challenge around visa. Like I wasn't able to work in one of the countries that we went to when we were doing the rugby thing. I haven't got the visa to work in Singapore, so that I can work in my Australian company, but I can't get a job here in Singapore. I think for me, coming with a professional background, that for me has been one of the most sort of triggering things, and that I'm finding dealing with people is that almost loss of self and identity that comes when so much of what, for me, so much was sort of my onus was placed around my career and what I did for work. What are your sorts of, is that something that you're seeing present quite regularly as well? And what sorts of advice are you giving to people when that actually that career anxiety is a big driver and that sort of side of things?
I mean, one of the things to look at is actually doing that research before moving. I know sometimes it's hard to, because moves can be quick, especially with the pandemic. And moving countries because of just restrictions in place in general. But I think it's looking at it in advance. Now, yes, in Singapore, if you're on a dependent pass, you can't work. But there are lots of other things you can do, okay? So it's looking at, as we've spoken about in the past, is if you're looking at it from an entrepreneurship point of view, setting up your company, and even before that, there are so many volunteering opportunities and networking opportunities. You know, you've been trying to get me on a walk once a month. I'm sorry, I haven't made it yet. But I think it's just looking at it and making the most out of any given situation. It's not something that happens overnight. It's also looking at partner support. So having that open conversation and saying, listen, okay, we're moving to a country where I can't work. If you have kids, then what are we going to do? If you don't have kids, what am I going to do? And then trying to make a plan in advance. Now, no matter how much you plan, and this is something where you also need to be careful, is that sometimes over planning can lead to quite a bit of disappointment. So it's having that level of flexibility and openness to say, okay, I'm going to give myself X many weeks, X many months. Here's what I'm going to look at overall. It does get easier. It wasn't easy at the beginning. I mean, as a kid, when I moved, it takes a long while to really settle into things. Same, you know, as a partner, as a spouse, depending on where you're traveling to and where you're living. But at the end of the day, it also comes down to looking at what opportunities are there, whether it's paid or not, and things sort of have a way of working out. When Suranga was here last in Singapore, and I was on a dependent pass, and the plan was then I ended up having to move back to London. I had a few months, and I actually ended up volunteering at 2 hospitals and also an animal shelter, which was amazing. Neil ended up adopting a dog to take back to London, but
that's how they prey. They prey on trailing spouses to rehome animals.
Exactly. So I mean, to be honest, yes, I had a few months where I could have just done nothing, but also it was just something for me to keep myself busy, keep myself occupied. And yes, at that time, it was a short-term plan. If you're going to be somewhere for years, then it's looking at longer-term plans and opportunities. But I have a lot of patients, a lot of friends actually who have, where it's not been easy initially, but then looking at opportunities available, things come up, things work out, and it's also then embracing it as well, to make the most of it for yourself and your family.
Yeah. So when you've got patients that have freshly sort of arrived and they are sort of looking to do things that might be, again, starting a business or building a network or volunteering or those sorts of things, is there advice that you're giving them to sort of like get themselves in order before they start going and doing anything else?
Sure. So we actually at Osler Health International, we have a new patient assessment. So here in Singapore, you still have to, we do a COVID check, so checking immunizations. And so when we have that sort of new patient check, what we tend to do is we have a booklet about healthcare in Singapore. So we go through that, but it's also then chatting about what their plans are and what their background is, and about kids, about family. So it's a really nice, it's one of my favorite appointments actually, because you get to chat, you get to know people, get to know their families, and also be able to signpost, especially if you're working, if you're not. But it's also, there are lots of organizations. So you've got the British Chamber, American Chamber, I'm sure Australia has one, plus with ANZA, for example, as well. And also, if you do sport, for me, that's a huge part. And that's how we met, is at the Singapore Cricket Club, is from a sports from a sporting point of view. It just opens up your network, and you just get to meet like-minded people, get to chat about your actual, where you've moved from or whether you've been here. And this is where you get that balance of meeting various people. And I think that's important, is looking at it. Now, not everyone does sport, but also as part of joining these sorts of clubs, they do other things. So you've got walks, you've got volunteering opportunities. We played netball together as part of it, and getting all the different sporting teams. So playing netball, not just with netball players, but with rugby players and cricketers and the tennis section. That was incredible, because this is just an opportunity where you're not stuck just within your sporting network and community. You're getting to know lots of different people.
That's so good. Sport's like the absolute clincher for me. Like, that's been a really key way in all of the places that I've moved. So overseas, but also when I moved around to different places in Australia, was I would find my netball team generally within the first few days, and that was how I would go. And particularly when I was traveling around by myself in my 20s, I would always, when I set up camp in a new place, I would find a netball team. And it was actually quite interesting. One of the toughest experiences that I had as a trailing spouse was with one of the rugby stints that we did with my husband, was that there was no netball in the town that he was playing in. And it became a very different experience for me, because my usual way of meeting people and finding other people, and something that was very much mine and my own, and that I went to training and that I got to do that by myself, I didn't have that. And I found myself having to navigate things in a different way, which was interesting. I hate to say it involved a lot more wine on the side of rugby fields, but I did find some kindred spirits that way as well. But it was definitely a different way of doing things for me. And we didn't have kids at the time, so that wasn't a way to sort of to meet people and things as well. I wanted to sort of change gear slightly around what it sort of looks like when you've got family members or yourself that have actually got health challenges prior to relocating to somewhere, a new town, a new state, a new country. What are some of the things that you might say if someone was preparing to leave Singapore, what sorts of advice would you be giving those individuals or their family, and their families before they are relocating around existing medical conditions?
I mean, chronic medical conditions are huge globally. And that's something that before any move happens, it's actually really important to look at where you're moving and what medical facilities are available. I would always signpost. So for me, for example, being where I still do my NHS work in the UK, in London, and anyone going back, it's directing them to, okay, here's what you've got, here's what you need to think about. So main things are, depending on the condition you have, and especially with kids, looking at it as looking for a specialist or initially actually a very good GP, because general practice and primary care is key. And I would recommend anyone moving anywhere in the world to make sure that you have a family doctor, because it's coordinating care and it's also looking at it holistically overall for the family. Because sometimes what can happen is if you just go to a specialist for one thing, the specialist specializes in that area, but it's looking at it overall. So a lot of chronic disease management also involves looking at mental health and well-being, looking at nutrition, looking at exercise, looking at sleep, so looking at the lifestyle pillars as well. So I'd say family practitioner, looking at it from a specialist point of view, but also from access to medication. At the moment, globally, there is actually quite a shortage of certain medications. So I have special interest in diabetes and women's health, and looking at it from diabetes medication, for women's health from HRT and menopause. In Singapore, we don't have access to everything that's available, say in UK, Australia. So then it's managing it and balancing it out, and then certain tweaks, changes have to be made. Medication can also change from whether it's generic to whether it's branded. And some people swear by one medication or the other, depending on the components in it, because you can sometimes react to various components. So it's looking at it from that point of view as well. So really my key points would be family practitioner would be looking at it from a specialist point of view, depending on the condition you have, access to medication, but also doing a little bit of research. I mean, one thing that I thought worked really well when I was with the US Embassy is having a sort of a sponsored family. So where before you moved, you were introduced to a family or a couple, or, you know, it's just somebody you could ask questions from. And if you had kids, so looking at it from a schooling point of view as well. I mean, access to education and school is so important. So that's where I would say is just getting that advice in advance so that you're as prepared as you can be.
Is there some sort of central, I guess, single source of truth as far as the carrying around of physical medications when you're traveling around globally? Because I know that must be an absolute challenge for things that might be legal in one country, might not be legal in other places, or what you actually need from doctors and things to be physically carrying the medication that you already have. And I guess this is not even just when you're moving, this is just something that when you happen to be mobile around the world.
And that actually more than actually physically moving to a country, it's looking at it from a work, holiday, travel point of view. And actually a lot of countries, and I always signpost my patients and actually even friends to the country's websites, because certain medication are illegal in certain countries, and that can vary from country to country. And also a lot to do with controlled medication. So these are sort of sleeping agents, some antidepressants, Also looking at it from diabetes injections point of view, so insulin and other sort of injectable treatments. And some of it also needs refrigerating. So how do you manage the cold chain? So sometimes you have to hand carry it because you need to inject yourself or you need to take medication. So what we tend to do is it's looking at it from a country point of view. And also when we dispense medication at Osler, there is a prescription plus a sticker that gets put on each of the medications. So it has all the details. I also recommend that, you can actually get a letter from the doctor saying, here's the medication, here's why you're on it, and we can do a medical summary. That's easy enough. Moving around from the UK with the NHS, you actually have your NHS prescription and you can get a medical summary as well. And I have the same from, families, patients moving from the US, from Europe, from Australia. So it's can be a bit of a hassle, but it just takes a bit of organizing and a bit of research.
Yeah, it's interesting. That seems to be like this whole can of worms that you need to be really across. If there's, like you said, if there's chronic health issues with you or your family, that's something to be really aware of and all over. I just wanted to sort of segue a little bit back after that, because you sort of mentioned, obviously, depression or anxiety medications as being something that, well, quite often that this crowd is predisposed to, or in some areas might be over-medicated in some places. That's another whole can of worms that we don't really need to open up. But I think going back to that headspace thing and the anxieties and things that a trailing spouse or their kids, I think that's something that we probably do need to talk about as well, bringing into this, is that it's the whole family unit, and it might even be the person you're trailing as well, that's a lot of pressure on them, so that the family unit or the couple or even the individual themselves. What are sort of the sort of steps to think about when you're assessing whether your recent relocation or whether you've been somewhere for a long time, but you're still feeling like a fish out of water? When do you brush off a low day or a low week or doing a bit of internal head noises as just, oh, it's just a bad day, or you might be premenstrual or something like that? And when does that start looking like of concern, I need to go and actually see the GP and start actually talking to someone? What sort of advice do you give around that, where it's sort of sometimes often by the spouse as well can be like, oh, you'll be right, like brush it off, go for a run or go and have a coffee with someone, through to, hang on, I've felt like this for a fair few days or weeks or months now, like I need to. Is there a sort of a rule of thumb for when to actually start going and asking for some help?
I think there's no rules per se. It is very much individualized. Some depending on where you're starting, where your baseline is actually. And I think it applies, as you mentioned, and that's really important. It's not just about the spouse, it's about both parties or the whole family as a unit. Because there's actually a lot of pressure on whoever's had to make the move, especially if you are the sole breadwinner at that point, if your partner can't work. And I think that's where sometimes we need to focus a little bit more on as well, because there's a lot of pressure that falls on one person's shoulders, thinking, gosh, I'm moving my entire family from where we feel comfortable, where we know, where we have our support network, our family, to somewhere completely new, and it's all on me. I've got to make sure that I'm working hard, I'm earning, I've got the kids in school if you've got family, I've got to make sure that my partner's okay. And it applies, it's just looking at it from both sides. One thing I would say actually is, as I mentioned earlier, it tends to be depending on where your baseline is. Somebody who does a lot of sport would be able to say, listen, I've had a rough few days, I'm going to play my tennis, so I'll go for my run, I'll go to the gym, and then actually feel absolutely fine after, and be able to have a conversation with the family and say, listen, I've had a difficult few days, but I feel I'm okay now, and I just wanted to let you know. And I think that communication piece is huge. it's also sometimes what we tend to notice is that the more you brush things off, the more it builds up. And this is where partners, friends, family can really play a huge role, is actually noticing changes. Is that person getting more anxious than usual? Are they looking more tired? Are they more snappy? I mean, that it can simply be, you go out to a meal and a waiter takes an order and for some reason, whoever you're with just snaps and, says something that you think, oh, that's a bit out of character. And instead of ignoring it, it's about actually talking through it and saying, oh, you seem a little on edge, what's going on? And I think that's important, is not to just ignore things and just sweep it under the carpet. Because a lot of the times before the person who is actually going through the difficulties notices anything, it's people around them. Sometimes it's a lot harder for the immediate family to notice things. So it could be, friends, it could be colleagues, and this applies to, both sides. And it's just making sure that it's our responsibility, if you see something that doesn't seem right, is to actually make a note of it and do something about it.
Yeah, it's a really challenging situation, and you can see why it actually is quite often a real pressure cooker in a household experience, because you've like you said, you've got the spouse who potentially has left career, has left financial independence, has left sense of purpose and things, landed somewhere different. Again, it could be a different country, it could be a different town, isolation from friends, isolation from family network and support, all of those things. But at the same time, that pressure on the person that they moved for or moved with, financially, knowing that all that load is on them, that's often something that you're right, that we don't give enough attention to that, and the pressures and things that go with the person whose job or physical location is the reason for the move in the first place. I guess my question around how to sort of be in the self-care, I guess, position of the trailing spouse, that generally sort of the well-being side of things for the whole family unit quite often falls on the trailing spouse. Advice on things around the actual well-being. I know we've talked around the sport and things, if that's for you, but if you're not a sporty person, if you're not sort of haven't got those outlets, is there advice that you've got for maintaining, I guess, the well-being of yourself as an individual, but then the family unit as well?
I mean, something to really consider, and I appreciate it's not for everyone, but it's actually psychological support, counselling. So whether it's done as a sort of a pre-assignment family counselling, so before you move, you either have individual counselling as a family, as a unit. But I think that plays a huge role. I mean, talking about things. And I know, again, a lot of people say, oh, that's not for me. But I think it's giving it an opportunity. Now, it could be that you're talking through things with your GP, in case your family doctor, your general practitioner. But also it's looking at it from a counsellor point of view or a psychologist. So it's being able to talk through things in order to gain certain insights that you otherwise wouldn't see yourself, or you wouldn't really get from someone who's not a professional and doesn't deal with it on a day-to-day basis, but also to gain some coping mechanisms. You're in a better position to manage things as and when they come up. I think preparation is key. I mean, again, with moving, you're looking at, if you're moving to a country where there is likely going to be a language barrier, it's thinking, okay, you know what, maybe I'm going to do some coaching, some lessons in looking at learning the language, or at least from a spoken point of view, and also a little bit about the culture, so that you've got things that you can think about and focus on rather than just the move. But I would highly recommend, either pre-moving counselling or psychological support, and have a lot of families who actually move and have had to move rather urgently, where when they do come to Singapore, there's a lot of options for counselling and psychology here, but it's looking at it from an individual therapy point of view, but also from a family unit. And that's one thing I always say is, even if it's for 5 minutes every day, sit and talk, phones away, technology away, no distractions. And those few minutes with your partner, with your kids, can, if you've got time, it could be more. But otherwise, to know you've set aside those 5 minutes every day at the same time, if that's possible, or even at any point, makes a big difference.
That's something that we've actually been doing in our family for a good few years now. So pre-move, and then we've continued doing it since moving to Singapore, is that at dinner, when we're sitting and having dinner together, we take it in terms of saying bad, better, best. And so we've got to come up with 3 things: something bad during the day, something that was better, and then the best thing for the day. And if there was nothing bad, you can do good, better, best.
Okay.
And and we sort of have over the time sort of added some other bits and pieces of things, and obviously some prepping that we did. I've got 2 young daughters, and a lot of the prepping that we did prior to the move was and something I'm looking forward to. So it might have been something at school, it could have been a birthday party, and it was quite good because of the amount of talking that we were doing those last sort of few weeks before we left. The pretty much resounding repeat for all 4 of us was, I'm really looking forward to our move and to our new friends and to our new place and our new school and all of these sorts of things. And I it's not until you say that I sort of, that's just something that's become daily life for us. And it's such a good thing. And I've actually found that it's been really interesting to almost gauge things with the kids, that something might have happened at school that it actually was upsetting or had actually sort of thrown them a bit during the day. But by the time they get home and, they've had a snack and had some time to sort of think, they sort of forget about it until you're sitting at the table and actually prompted. And I sometimes think that might have just gone sort of banked up a bit if there hadn't been that vent about it on the day. So that's been something that I didn't realize that we were doing such a good job of that. Look at us.
And this is where, when it becomes the norm, you almost not take, you don't, it's not about taking for granted, but it just is just part and parcel of. And until somebody actually talks about it, or like me bringing it up here, you don't realize you're either doing it or not doing it, and how important it is. Because especially with kids, it's not easy to move. I've been there, it takes time, and having that support, being able to have a conversation about it in an open, safe setting with your parents, with your family members, is huge. And the more you end up parking stuff, or as you said, banking things, it builds up. And in kids especially, it can show up in so many different ways. They might start to get more reserved, they might be more angry, it might be affecting their sleep. And it might even, you may not even realize it until it starts, to affect their schoolwork. And then teachers come into play saying, okay, what's changed? But by that point, it could be weeks or months into things. So it's always looking at it. And, these are 2-3 minutes. It's having one meal as a family a day, if you can. I know it's not always easy, especially with life in general, work schedules, but it's incredible. Just those few minutes just to say, right, what's happened today, and as you said, it was bad, better, best. It was brilliant.
Yeah, it's good. I think something as well that it's so funny that our bad, better, best came to mind first before the fact that I see a psychologist once a month, and I have done for a good number of years, and I am still seeing my psychologist in Australia remotely, and I have a standing monthly appointment with her. And that was something that I from very early on from doing it had sort of tried to talk about it as much as I could with anyone that would listen. Like I would sort of just casually throw into a conversation like, oh yeah, I was talking to my psychologist. And particularly in Australia, and particularly in rural Australia, that would quite often get some raised eyebrows and be quite confronting, because people, it's still, I know in Australia and globally, it is getting better, and we're better at talking about well-being, mental health, but also the support that goes around it. I'm always just so impressed with my American friends who, like, therapy is just so part of daily life for so many people that they think it's weird that Australians are so odd about getting help. Like, what do you mean you don't have a therapist? That's weird that you don't. So I love that they are all over it. But I don't actually think anything of it anymore because I've been doing it for so long and it's just a standing appointment in my calendar. But what's really interesting is if for some reason one of us has to cancel and it's a couple of months between appointments, I actually do notice it. And it's more that I think I haven't had my hour of self-indulgence for the month, which I get to talk to someone completely outside of my day-to-day realm of life, someone that completely doesn't know all the ins and outs and the intricacies and things of the day-to-day, but she hears on a monthly basis what I'm up to and she monitors the things. But I think she can really notice as well when I haven't been for a few months, I do a lot more of a dump on her when we're talking. And so I think that that's actually really good advice, and doing that as a preparation thing. Like mine was very much reactive when I first started seeing a psychologist. And so I was in a bit of world of pain when I first started seeing her, but it's been like obviously a long time seeing her on a monthly basis. And I think that it has very much switched into a like proactive situation rather than a reactive one. And that I know that I've got that little vent as well, that I can say whatever I want. I can be as mean as I want about my husband or my friend or whoever, my children, and there is no judgment, and that I can get that off my chest. But I think that in preparation for moving somewhere is a really, really interesting piece of advice.
Yeah, and actually it makes a big difference. And the same goes to when you're changing careers or when you're retiring. And that's really, really important because you don't realize the impact that change has in general. I've struggled, with moving, with changing, with adapting, and that's with all the sort of support networks, all the extra things I have in place. So you can only imagine when you're juggling 150 things, thinking of moving, having to move, or it happens last minute. And then everything just hits you. All it takes is a few minutes of quiet, and then it just hits you like a ton of bricks. And at that point, as you mentioned, you're ending up having to be reactive. Whereas if you have been proactive and taken that time, the coping mechanisms kick in and you know how to manage things. Or if you don't, then you know you have access to support. And that's actually something that I find really important, is looking at it being individual. As I said, it's not for everyone, okay? And also now with technology, and that's where, we're on a Zoom call, we are probably 10, 15 minutes down the road from each other, but on a Sunday morning, we're on a Zoom call. And this is where it's not about, because also finding a counselor or psychologist is not easy, somebody who works with you and you actually have that trust in, and sometimes it can take a few goes. So if there's somebody you have been working with for a long time and you trust them and you want to continue, now with technology, it's not something that just needs to stop. As you mentioned, your psychologist is in Australia and you do a once a month catch up, and that really helps. And sometimes it could be that they might not be able to understand where you are and the culture, etc., associated with it. But as a professional, that's something that, same as a general practitioner, we can then look into and say, right, where are they moving to? Let me do a bit of research into this. Have you thought about this? Have you looked at this website? Have you thought, looking at the culture, looking at language? But that's part of our education as well. And that's something I thoroughly enjoy, because you're working on a journey with your patient, with the family.
That's actually been quite an interesting concept with us, is the fact that my psychologist doesn't understand this actually lived experience of us relocating. And we did a lot of talking in the preparation for me leaving as well, and for us leaving as a family. But I think it's been almost a blessing in disguise, because she hasn't come with any preconceived notions about it, the expat experience, or she also hasn't sort of become almost blasé or immune to it, which I think can also happen. And I think that that's what's really interesting when you're trying to find that person for you. And yes, it can take a few goes of test driving therapists and psychologists and counsellors and those sorts of things till you find someone that you mesh with. But sometimes maybe someone elsewhere or outside of where you would normally sort of play is actually of benefit as well.
It's also a different perspective, right? Because there's no, as you mentioned, there's no bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and that person knows you from before the move and then can see changes happening after the move and can actually hold you accountable as well, because they've given you the coping mechanisms to sort of manage things, and then they can actually see when things are changing and be able to pick things up a lot sooner than people around you, even though you're spending a lot more time with your family, with your friends, and with your network wherever you are.
Okay, I'm going to ask you for some bits of advice, but they're going to be in sections.
Okay.
My first question is, what advice have you got for people that are pre-moving to a farm, pre-moving to the next base or your first army base, your first expat experience? What have you got for the advice for if you haven't left yet?
Okay. I'd say conversation and communication. Okay. So that is, I know it's quite a large bracket and a large umbrella, but having a conversation with your partner, with your family, considering pre-assignment family counseling, and also even, doing some research as to where you're moving, looking at it from am I able to work? Am I able to continue what I am doing? Am I able to play my sport or do my extracurricular activities there? What about language? Is there a language barrier? Should I be looking at the language and the culture before I move? So it's preparation, and especially with kids, it's looking at schooling, because honestly, once your kids are settled, that takes a huge burden off you as a family. And again, that's where it's a lot easier when you know the move is coming and you have a few months to prepare. A lot harder if it happens quickly. But either way, I'd look at those sort of key steps as a starting point before moving.
Great. Okay. Advice for those that are early stages. They've already made the move. They might be feeling a little bit like, okay, where next? But what be those ones that are early trailing spouse experience?
Sure. Look for a family doctor, a general practitioner, okay? Because register the whole family, make sure that you have that initial contact, either as an individual or as a whole family, because it's making sure that you're aware of the healthcare environment you're in. Because at the end of the day, if you know what to expect to a certain extent, if something happens, the pressure is less, you're more prepared, get to know the emergency numbers. It's here in Singapore, fire and ambulance is 995 and police is 999. And that's different globally. It's not just don't expect. And I can tell you a lot of doctors want to know that as well. So it's just having that extra bit of preparation. So yeah, good family doctor, make sure you're registered, and honestly, have that initial contact. It doesn't mean you don't need to just go see a doctor when you're unwell. Okay. It's about knowing that you've got that extra bit of support network. Second is from a kids and schooling point of view is make sure you go for your sort of introductory meetings, there's lots of other sort of meeting new families. You mentioned with the kids, there were so many new families that moved last year, and you had quite a few sort of opportunities to meet the various parents as well, which is a really nice way. And then if you're thinking about it from a sport point of view, volunteering point of view, or if you're thinking, I want to retrain, I want to study, I want to learn a language, look at options and don't just think about it, actually do it.
Okay, third lot. I'm in an absolute tailspin. Like I might have been somewhere for 6 or 12 months already, or for an extended period of time, or I might have had, say, kids have finally all started school and that real identity crisis has kicked right in. feeling pretty ordinary.
Mhm.
Where next?
So I think, again, this comes down to where your base level is. So if you've done that pre-move preparation, that early move registering with your general practitioner, with a family doctor, that would be your first point of call, okay? If, like yourself, you've got a psychologist who you've been seeing for a long time, even if it's virtual, it's get in contact, have that conversation. And then also looking at support from the family, having an open conversation, having a family meeting and saying, listen, I am in this position. I just can't control it. I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I appreciate it's having an impact on the whole family. And this is actually something that I do a lot with my patients, women who have the perimenopause and menopause, is I actually share a video of a link where a partner has a conversation with the general public about how they manage to what their point of view. You know, it's not easy just to only hear it from your partner. It can actually be a lot better when it comes from somebody else. So one of the links I share is this video to a partner talking about their experience with going through, with somebody who's going through the menopause and perimenopause, and how they notice changes and what they felt they could have done better and what they would do in the future.
If you're happy to share that link with me, I will put it in the bottom of this video. Dr. Tash, very much appreciated as always. I've banked a whole lot of information for myself here, selfishly.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for your time.
Anytime. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for the invite and the opportunity.